The world had grown quiet in a way that felt almost unfamiliar. For the first time in decades, the wind above the Swiss Alps carried nothing but the soft murmur of pine needles and the distant hum of restoration drones patching the last scars of the Omnic crisis. Snow fell in careful spirals, indifferent to politics, indifferent to memory. Below the ridges, in villages once emptied by war, chimneys glowed again. Children walked to schools rebuilt from the rubble of their parents' generation. Overwatch, long fractured and long mourned, had begun to breathe once more, gathering its scattered survivors like embers coaxed back into flame. It was the kind of fragile peace that felt undeserved, and precisely because of that, precious. Then the sky broke. There was no warning, no tremor beneath the earth, no thunder rolling across the peaks. Only a sudden blinding seam opening high above the clouds, as though the heavens themselves had been cut by an unseen blade. The fracture pulsed with colors that had no name, hues that felt more like memories than light. Auroras spilled across continents in the same heartbeat. In Reykjavik, street lamps flickered. In Nairobi, satellite feeds dissolved into static. In orbit, every satellite briefly ceased to exist, then reappeared as though nothing had happened. Their instruments confused, their operators terrified. From the wound in the sky, something fell. Not a weapon, not a vessel. A man. He struck the mountainside without sound, snow erupting around him in a wide, silent halo. When the powder settled, he lay on his back, blue eyes open to a sun that was almost, but not quite, the one he remembered. His chest rose slowly. The suit he wore was torn at the shoulder, and yet the emblem across it, a curving symbol older than his memory, remained unbroken. Clark Kent had known many awakenings, in cornfields as a child, in hospital beds after impossible battles, in the arms of a woman whose voice he could still hear when the wind was gentle. But this waking felt different. The light on his skin did not warm him the way it should. It fed him, yes, but with a rhythm slightly out of step, as though the star above were speaking a familiar language with an unfamiliar accent. He sat up, and the world rushed in. 10,000 voices reached his ears at once. A mother in Osaka humming a lullaby, a soldier in Numbani reciting a prayer, a boy in Rio laughing at a joke his brother had told 100 times. Machines whispered too, gentle and mechanical, their inner monologues threaded through cities like veins of quiet thought. Clark closed his eyes and forced the noise back, the way one might quiet a storm inside a jar. It took longer than it ever had before. He rose slowly. His boots did not sink into the snow. Beneath him, the mountain groaned. Somewhere far below, a low rumble had begun, a shelf of ice loosened by the impact of his arrival, an avalanche. Clark did not think. He never did in such moments. He simply moved. Hikers screamed as the white wall descended upon them. They braced for the crush, for the burial, for the silence that swallowed climbers in these mountains every winter. Instead, they felt a wind that was not wind, a force that lifted them one by one from the tumbling ice, setting them upon a ridge above the destruction. When they turned to thank whoever had saved them, there was only footprints in the snow, and above, a figure vanishing into the clouds without a sound. Miles away, inside the reforged halls of Overwatch, alarms of a strange and unfamiliar tone began to sing. Winston hunched over his console, banana forgotten in his hand, his eyes narrowing at readings that made no scientific sense. Tracer arrived first, still adjusting her Chronel accelerator. Genji followed in silence, Mercy behind him with a satchel of medical gear, and Sojourn last, her expression already carved into the shape of command. "Null sector?" Sojourn asked. Winston shook his head slowly. "I do not know what this is. But whatever fell from that rift, it saved 42 civilians in under 9 seconds and left no signature we can trace. They deployed within minutes." What they found at the crash site was nothing but disturbed snow and an outline pressed deep into the mountainside, a shape that resembled a man but bore the weight of something far heavier. Mercy knelt beside the impression, her scanner trembling in her gloved hand. The biological readings were incomplete, contradictory, impossible. Genji stood at the edge of the crater, motionless. He felt something in the air that no instrument could measure, a stillness, a center. A soul, perhaps, though he would not have used that word aloud. Tracer, ever the first to break silence, offered a soft grin. Whoever he is, our flying Boy Scout is fast. Yet even her voice held something uncertain, something reverent. Far above them, hidden among the drifting clouds, Clark watched. He watched the way these strangers spoke to one another, the way they treated the wounded, the way none of them looked to the sky for salvation. And a thought struck him, cold as the mountain air. This earth had never needed a god. Perhaps, he wondered, it never should. He almost turned to leave, almost let the rift close behind whatever memory of him remained. But then he saw the great figure approaching alone across the ridge, unarmed, hands open. "Whoever you are," Winston called gently into the wind, "we could use your help." The watchpoint at Gibraltar had once been a monument to certainty. Its corridors, long stripped of the confidence of an earlier age, now carried the softer echoes of rebuilding. Wires ran along walls that had not yet been sealed. Portraits of the fallen hung in the main hall, their names softly illuminated. Clark walked those corridors slowly, aware of every footstep, every heartbeat around him, every quiet sorrow layered into the concrete. Winston had not asked him his name, not yet. Instead, the great scientist had offered him tea, a chair, and time. The kindness disarmed Clark more than any weapon could have. He accepted the cup, though he did not drink. He listened. Winston spoke of the Omnic crisis first, of machines that had once been servants turning upon their creators, of the desperate formation of Overwatch, of years of impossible victories. He spoke of the fall, of betrayal from within, of Overwatch declared illegal, of heroes scattered across continents like leaves after a storm. He spoke of Null Sector, of Talon, of political rot, of the slow poisoning of trust. And then, quietly, he spoke of the rebuilding, of Tracer answering the recall, of Mercy returning despite her grief, of Genji finding his brother, of ordinary people unpowered choosing to stand. Clark absorbed each word carefully. In his own world, wars had been ended by the arrival of a single being. Cities had been saved because he had chosen to save them. Here, every mile of peace had been paid for in the blood of people who could not fly, could not lift mountains, could not survive a bullet, and yet they had chosen, again and again, to fight anyway. He had never felt so humbled. Mercy examined him that evening, though she asked before every scan and paused whenever his eyes flickered with unease. Her instruments told her stories she could scarcely believe. His cells drank sunlight the way plants drank rain, converting stellar radiation into raw kinetic potential with an efficiency that violated every known law. She wrote her notes carefully, precisely. And then, on impulse, she closed the file and encrypted it beneath 3 separate protocols. Something in her instinct warned her that these readings should never be seen by the wrong eyes. She was right to fear. In a laboratory buried deep beneath the sands of an unmapped Talon outpost, Moira Odia Rain leaned toward a screen glowing with stolen data. Her red eyes drank in numbers she had spent her entire career dreaming of. Here at last was proof that biology could transcend its own limitations. Here at last was the ladder to the next step of the human species. She smiled, and the smile did not touch her face. Doomfest stood behind her, arms folded, his gauntlet dim in the low light. He did not speak for a long while. When he did, his voice was calm, almost affectionate. "A symbol," he said. "That is what he is. Break the symbol, and you break the world's belief in mercy." Ramattra received the reports in silence, seated upon a throne carved from the wreckage of an Omnic factory, his metallic fingers laced together. His mind, both machine and philosopher, turned the information slowly. This being from beyond the sky did not preach superiority, did not demand worship, did not draw lines between organic and synthetic life. That, more than any weapon, made him dangerous. Ramattra had built his entire ideology upon the certainty that peace was impossible without dominance. Superman's very existence threatened that foundation. Meanwhile, Clark chose his first missions with care. He did not join military operations. He asked instead to help where help was quietly needed. A collapsed dam in Bangladesh, a wildfire in the outskirts of Sydney, an earthquake in Anatolia. He worked alongside rescue teams rather than above them. He carried wounded children to Mercy's stretchers. He lifted vehicles so that firefighters could reach the trapped. He asked no questions and gave no speeches. Sojourn watched him from a distance during a mission in Cairo, her mechanical eye recording every motion. She had commanded soldiers in wars where mercy was a luxury few could afford. She had made choices that still visited her in dreams. And yet, watching this stranger refuse to leave even a single stranger behind, she felt something she had not felt in years. Not admiration, something quieter. A memory of who she had once wanted to be before the wars. The public noticed, of course. They could not help but notice. Footage of him spread across every network, edited and re-edited into 1,000 shapes. Some declared him a savior sent by fate. Others whispered that he was another engineered weapon, another catastrophe waiting to happen. Governments convened emergency sessions. Analysts debated whether an entity of such power could ever be regulated. Some suggested containment. Others suggested elimination. Clark heard all of it. He could not help but hear, and each opinion, each fear, each hope weighed upon him. Genji found him sitting alone one evening upon the cliffs beyond Gibraltar, watching the sun descend into the Atlantic. The cyborg said nothing at first. He simply sat beside him. When at last he spoke, his voice was as calm as still water. "You carry a great silence within you," Genji said. "It is not sadness. It is the weight of choices not yet made." Clark almost smiled. "Do you always speak like a monk? Only when the moment deserves it." They sat together as the light faded. But peace, Clark had learned long ago, was the shortest chapter of any story. Doomfest moved first. Coordinated strikes ignited across 4 continents within a single hour: Sydney, Lagos, Mumbai, Rio de Janeiro. Each attack was designed to force a single terrible question. Where would Superman choose to go, and who would he choose to leave behind? For the first time since his arrival, Clark rose into the sky uncertain. His speed could reach any city in seconds. But cities, he realized with a hollow ache, were not the same as people, and no matter how fast he flew, he was still in the end only one man. The sky above Sydney bloomed with fire as the first tower fell. Clark reached the harbor in a single breath, and the moment his boots touched the burning promenade, he made a decision that would define every day thereafter. He would not choose. He would not abandon. He would trust. He opened the communication channel Winston had given him, and for the first time, he asked for help. Tracer answered before the sentence was finished. Her voice crackled through the comms with that impossible brightness that had always carried Overwatch through its darkest hours. Within seconds, Crenel distortions rippled through Mumbai as she blinked between collapsing buildings, pulling children from doorways moments before the walls came down. She did not stop to breathe. She did not have the luxury. Her accelerator burned hot against her chest, and still she pushed further, faster, again and again. Lucio arrived in Rio without armor, without weapons of destruction. He carried only his music and the healing frequencies that had once saved his neighborhood from corporate tyranny. He climbed to the rooftop of a collapsing favela and began to sing, and where his song reached, terror softened into motion. Thousands of civilians who might have frozen in panic instead moved together, guided by a rhythm that reminded them who they were. Genji vanished into Lagos, silent as a rumor, and by the time Talon operatives realized their communications had been severed, 3 of their infrastructure hubs were already smoldering. He did not kill. He never killed anymore. But he made certain that no further attacks would rise from the ashes of that city. Mercy moved between all 4 theaters, guided by Winston's coordination. Her Valkyrie suit shimmered like a small sun above the ruined streets. She stabilized the dying, she comforted the newly orphaned, and though her hands trembled between patients, her voice never did, and Clark held the center. He caught a falling tower in Sydney, lowering it gently onto a public square emptied by Tracer's evacuation. He extinguished a chemical fire in Mumbai with a single breath. He lifted a train off a shattered bridge in Rio, holding it above the abyss until every passenger walked to safety. He did not stop moving. He did not permit himself to stop, and still people died. A grandmother in Lagos whose apartment had already collapsed before Genji arrived. A firefighter in Sydney who ran back inside a building one time too many. A boy in Mumbai who had let go of his sister's hand in the panic. Clark heard each of them fall silent. He heard the exact heartbeat when each one ended, and he carried those silences with him as he moved to the next street, the next fire, the next scream. By the time the last threat was contained, the sun had risen upon a world that did not know whether to celebrate or mourn. Clark stood upon the rubble of what had once been a public library in Sydney. His cape torn, his shoulders heavy, Sojourn approached him slowly. She did not offer platitudes. She had commanded enough soldiers to know that words were sometimes cruelty in disguise. "You did more than any of us could have," she said quietly. "I did not do enough," Clark answered. She nodded. It was the truest answer either of them could give. The world responded exactly as Doomfest had known it would. In the days that followed, admiration and fear rose together like twin tides. Statues were proposed in 3 capitals. Legislation was drafted in 4 others. Talk shows debated the ethics of trusting a being whose loyalties were unknown, whose origin remained unexplained, whose very existence broke the natural order. Petitions circulated demanding that Superman submit to international registration. Counter-petitions demanded that he be granted full sovereignty over the skies. In his hidden fortress, Doomfest watched the debates with quiet satisfaction. He did not need to strike again, he only needed to wait. Conflict, he had always believed, was the forge that shaped humanity, and the forge was now burning brightly, but something else was burning too. In the days following the coordinated attacks, strange phenomena began to spread across the planet. Gravitational anomalies bent the tides. Compasses spun in remote regions of Siberia. Migratory birds abandoned ancient patterns. In Antarctica, beneath layers of ice older than recorded history, a network of symbols began to glow with a soft blue light. Ramattra received the reports first. His agents in Null's sector had long maintained observation posts in the most forgotten corners of the world. When the reports reached him, he did not speak for a long time. His mind, so accustomed to processing threats and possibilities, could find no framework for what he was reading. The symbols were older than Omnics, older than humanity, older than the geological strata surrounding them, and they were responding to something. Somewhere off the coast of the Arctic, seismographs recorded a rising tremor. Winston noticed it during an otherwise unremarkable morning, coffee steaming beside his console. He frowned, tapped the readings, and frowned again. The pattern was rhythmic, almost heartbeat-like. Something beneath the ice was waking. He called Clark to the observation deck. Together they watched satellite imagery reveal an enormous shape emerging slowly through the polar ice. It was not a ship. It was not a weapon. It was a construct, vast and geometric, its architecture unlike anything ever recorded upon Earth. Winston's voice cracked slightly as he spoke. "This," he said, "is not from any known civilization." Clark stared at the readings, and something within him stirred, a memory that was not his. A dream half-remembered from childhood, his mother's voice reading him a Kryptonian legend, stories of living suns and the roads between worlds. He did not know yet how or why, but he understood, with a certainty deeper than knowledge, that whatever had emerged from the ice was connected to him. The rift had not been an accident. Something had summoned him here. The construct rose through the Arctic ice in a silence so profound it made the world hold its breath. Its surfaces were smooth and dark, marked with symbols that pulsed faintly with an inner rhythm. Snow slid from its flanks like water from the hide of an ancient animal. It was not machinery in any sense the Overwatch scientists could easily define. It felt grown rather than built, shaped by intention rather than industry. Winston established the primary research camp 2 miles from the site, close enough to observe, far enough to survive if the structure decided that observers were unwelcome. Clark spent the first day walking its perimeter alone. He listened. He felt. The construct did not speak, but it hummed with a resonance that reached beneath his skin, into a place within him that had never before been touched. Mercy performed spectral analysis on the symbols. Sojourn organized security perimeters. Tracer coordinated liaisons with international observers who arrived in nervous delegations. And Genji, unusually still, sat cross-legged upon a snowbank and simply looked. The breakthrough came on the 3rd day, when one of Winston's engineers stumbled upon a chamber beneath the outer shell. Inside they found records. not written in language, but stored in crystalline lattices that projected memory when touched by certain wavelengths of light. Mercy, gentle as always with the unknown, was the first to activate one. The chamber filled with images that had waited for millions of years to be seen. A civilization that had walked the earth long before the first mammal. Tall, luminous beings with faces that seemed to carry the weight of stars. They had built cities that folded through dimensions rather than sprawling across land. They had studied the fabric of reality with instruments the size of moons, and they had traveled endlessly to universes beyond counting. Their final records were the most disturbing. They spoke of living suns, protectors born within dying worlds and cast across the multiverse by dimensional currents no engineer could fully control. These beings arrived unannounced, always alone, always at the threshold of great catastrophes. Their presence was neither salvation nor doom. They were, the records said, the immune response of the multiverse itself. Clark stood before the projection for a long time after the others had retreated to warm themselves. The images played on, indifferent to his silence. He recognized the shape of certain symbols. He remembered them from stories his mother had told him, stories he had believed to be metaphor, stories about Rao, about the origins of Kryptonian myth, about the reason his people had once been called children of the sun. He was, perhaps, not the first. He was, perhaps, not the last. He was one of many, and the multiverse was watching. Elsewhere, Talon moved. Moira had spent the past days working with a hunger that consumed her sleep, her appetite, her caution. The genetic sample she had extracted, drawn from a single strand of hair caught upon Mercy's laboratory floor, was more than enough. She sequenced. She simulated, she spliced. And she did not question, because to question would have been to slow down. Doomfest did not slow her. Ramattra did. To the surprise of every faction on the planet, the leader of Null Sector requested, through channels that had long thought dormant, a meeting with Winston. Not a truce, not an alliance, a conversation. Winston debated for hours. Sojourn opposed it. Tracer opposed it more loudly. But Clark, whose voice carried more weight than he wished it did, quietly urged acceptance. They met in a neutral chamber constructed on the edge of the construct. Ramattra arrived without guards. Winston arrived without weapons. Clark stood between them, not as protector, but as witness. Ramattra studied Clark for a long moment before speaking. His voice, when it came, was calm and mournful. "You do not belong here," he said. "I know," Clark answered. "And yet you refuse to leave. I cannot leave a wounded world simply because it did not ask for me." Ramattra considered this. His fingers curled slowly around the head of his staff. "You speak of every life as equal, organic, synthetic, enemy, friend. Do you truly believe this, or is it a comfort you tell yourself to justify your power?" Clark did not answer immediately. He looked at Winston, at the great scientist who had once been an experiment, then back at Ramattra, who had once been a slave. "I believe," he said at last, "that any philosophy which requires the suffering of others to prove itself is not a philosophy. It is an excuse." Ramattra was silent for a long time. "Then you and I," he said finally, "share more common ground than either of us would prefer." They did not become friends. They did not become allies. But they agreed in that quiet room beneath a sky of ancient symbols to cooperate upon a single matter. Someone was reopening the machinery of the first civilization. Someone was preparing to use it. And whatever emerged from that reopening would not distinguish between organic and synthetic lives when it decided who deserved to survive. Genji, standing outside the chamber, listened to the conversation through the walls he could not see through. When Clark emerged, the cyborg placed a hand upon his shoulder. "You are learning," Genji said, "that not every enemy must be defeated. Some must only be understood." Clark nodded slowly. That night, deep within the fortress Moira had claimed as her own, the first artificial subject was awakened. He was a former Talon operative who had volunteered for experimentation in exchange for his family's protection. When the tubes drained and the seals broke, he opened his eyes, and the eyes were no longer human. He rose without pain. He tore through 6 inches of reinforced steel with a single motion. His skin glowed faintly beneath the laboratory lights. He looked at Moira and he asked, in a voice that carried strange harmonics, why he could hear the heartbeat of the sun. Moira smiled, and Doomfest, standing behind her, allowed himself, for the first time in years, to laugh softly. The Kryptonian project had succeeded. They had built something that should never have been built. And somewhere far above them, upon a wind-swept ridge overlooking the Arctic coast, Clark Kent looked toward the stars and felt, without knowing why, a chill that no cold on Earth could explain. The first sign came in the form of a distress signal from a mining colony north of the Bering Strait. It was fragmented, panicked, and by the time Overwatch arrived, the colony no longer existed, not destroyed, erased. As though the ground itself had been peeled away by hands too large to imagine. Craters bore no scorch marks. Debris was arranged in circles, as though flung outward by a single central impact. Clark examined the site alone. He knelt in the frozen earth and touched the ground with 2 fingers. He felt the residue of an energy signature that he recognized in his bones. Solar radiation, imitated but not identical. Kryptonian in structure but hollow. A pale reflection of what he carried within him. He rose slowly. His jaw tightened. Someone had taken pieces of him and made monsters from them. The imitations struck again within hours. A hydroelectric dam in Norway, a shipping hub in Singapore, a refugee settlement in Kenya. Each attack was more chaotic than the last, as though the creatures barely understood their own strength. Tearing through structures without direction. They killed without hatred. They destroyed without goal. They simply existed, and existence for them was agony. Clark reached the Kenyan settlement first. He arrived to find a creature crouched over the bodies of 3 aid workers, its glowing eyes wide with confusion. It looked up at him, and for a moment Clark thought he saw something almost human in that gaze. Fear, bewilderment, the dim echo of the man who had once been beneath the transformation. He did not strike. He extended his hand. "You do not have to do this," he said gently. The creature roared and lunged. Clark caught it, held it, subdued it without killing it, and carried it away from the settlement while civilians fled behind him. Mercy arrived within minutes. She sedated the creature. She wept, quietly, without letting anyone see, when her scanners revealed the human tissue still tangled within the artificial genome. Sojourn arrived last. She looked at Clark, at the subdued creature, at Mercy's tears. "You could have ended it in seconds," she said, not accusing, only observing. "I could have," Clark answered. "Why did you not?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Because if I begin choosing which lives to end, I will not stop." Sojourn did not respond. But something in her mechanical eye recalibrated, and she filed away his answer in a place she would return to often in the years to come. Talon accelerated production. Moira, no longer patient, released a full generation of subjects at once. Dozens of them tore across the map, drawn to gravitational anomalies that intensified around the Arctic construct. Governments panicked, cities emptied, refugees fled by the millions. Overwatch was stretched beyond breaking, and then the construct opened. The great structure buried in the Arctic ice began to rise fully from the ground, its geometry unfolding into layers no observer could fully comprehend. Its symbols flared brighter than the northern sun. Above it, the sky rippled and dimensional currents began to bleed into the atmosphere. Cities on 3 continents reported strange skies. In Kyoto, cherry blossoms bloomed in the middle of winter. In Vancouver, buildings from a different era briefly appeared and then vanished. In Cairo, the pyramids momentarily doubled, casting 2 shadows at once. Reality itself was beginning to fracture. Clark and Winston reached the construct together. Ramattra arrived shortly after, flanked by a small honor guard of null sector operatives. They descended into the heart of the structure, guided by symbols that pulsed as though welcoming them. What they found within was not machinery, it was a wound. A dimensional aperture torn wide open by external tampering. Doomfest stood before the aperture. He was not surprised to see them. "You have come," he said, his voice calm as stone. "I had wondered whether you would." Clark stepped forward. "Close the gate." "I cannot," Doomfest answered. "And more importantly, I would not. This world has been waiting too long for its final crucible." Behind him, Moira watched with the eyes of a woman who no longer distinguished between science and worship. Beside her, the enhanced subjects gathered, silent and unblinking. The battle began without warning. Clark moved first, faster than any observer could follow. Doomfest met him with a strike that had shattered mountains before, and the two of them collided within the construct in a burst of light that shook the entire Arctic shelf. Winston engaged the enhanced subjects, roaring with the fury of a scientist forced back into the beast he had once been. Ramattra fought beside him, his staff carving arcs of dark energy through the air. Above them, the aperture widened. Reality began to merge. Alternate versions of the Earth briefly overlapped with the true one. A city that had never been built rose momentarily over the ruins of an ancient forest. A version of Winston as an unmodified gorilla ran through the corridors before vanishing. Dozens of Ramattras appeared and disappeared, some benevolent, some monstrous. Mercy, stationed at the surface, watched the sky tear. She activated her Valkyrie suit and rose into the storm to reach a group of civilians trapped upon a research vessel. She reached them, she stabilized them, and then a fragment of the collapsing dimensional field struck her from the side and she fell. Sojourn caught her before she hit the ice, but the injuries were severe. Mercy, the woman who had saved thousands, lay unconscious in the arms of a soldier who had never known how to pray. The watchpoint at Gibraltar was struck next. A dimensional echo of an omnic warship from an alternate timeline crashed through its main tower, obliterating decades of memory in an instant. The recall broadcasts fell silent. The world, for a terrible moment, believed Overwatch had died. Ramattra lost thousands of omnics to the collapse. He felt each shutdown as a small death within his own mind, and Doomfest, bleeding but standing, laughed. "Do you see now?" he called to Clark across the shaking construct. "This is what humanity truly is. This is the strength that only fire can shape." Clark, kneeling amid the ruin, raised his eyes. He did not answer. Because for the first time since his arrival, he did not know if hope was enough. Silence his weight. In the days that followed the collapse of the watchpoint, silence pressed upon the world like a mountain. Cities held their breath. Governments refused to comment. Broadcast towers played only static, then old music, then nothing. The people, so often noisy in their fear, had grown too tired even for grief. Yet somewhere within that silence, hope stirred. It began with Winston. He had survived the collapse of Gibraltar, though barely. His shoulder was fractured. His glasses were shattered. His laboratory, his sanctuary of decades, was rubble. And yet he stood upon the ruin of his home, unbowed, staring at the horizon with a stubborn clarity that had always defined him. He did not weep. He did not curse. He simply began, alone at first, to lift the fallen beams and place them aside. Tracer joined him within an hour. Her hair was singed. Her accelerator was dented. She smiled anyway, and the smile did more for the world than 1,000 speeches could have. Genji arrived next, carrying his brother upon his back. Hanzo, whose feud with Genji had once seemed eternal, had answered the call. The two brothers worked in silence beside the ruins, and something in that quiet cooperation felt like the beginning of a new age. Mercy awoke on the third day. Her body was broken, but her voice was steady. From her hospital bed, she began coordinating a global medical network of every hospital, clinic, and rescue team still functioning. She could not walk. She refused to stop working, and Ramattra came. He arrived at the ruined watchpoint alone, without honor guard, without ceremony. Winston looked up from his labor, and the two of them stared at each other for a long moment. Neither spoke. Then Ramattra bent down and lifted a fallen beam, and Winston, after a pause, moved to help him carry it. That image, captured by a single drone and broadcast across the fractured world, became the spark that reignited humanity. If Ramattra could stand beside Winston, then perhaps the future was not yet lost. Clark did not return immediately. He had disappeared into the mountains after the collapse, and no scanner could find him. He needed the silence. He needed the distance. He needed, more than anything, to understand what he had failed to prevent. He sat upon a peak overlooking a frozen lake, and for the first time in his life, he permitted himself to grieve without holding it back. He wept for the aid workers in Kenya. He wept for the omnics Ramattra had lost. He wept for Mercy's broken body and Winston's ruined home. He wept for the boy in Mumbai who had let go of his sister's hand, and then, slowly, he wept for himself, for the burden of always arriving too late, for the endless calculations of whom to save first, for the loneliness of being the only creature in the sky. When his tears ended, the sun rose upon him, and something within him steadied, not hardened, steadied. He understood now what the living sons of the first civilization had truly been. They had not been saviors, they had been catalysts. Their arrival had not been meant to solve every crisis. It had been meant to remind civilizations of what they were capable of, if they chose to remember. He returned to the watchpoint at dawn. The survivors were gathered in the ruined main hall. Winston, Tracer, Genji, Hanzo, Sojourn, Mercy upon a mobile bed, Lucio, DVA, Reinhardt, who had come out of retirement without being asked, Zenyatta, whose calm was a balm to every wound, and Ramattra standing apart but present. Clark walked to the center of the hall. His cape was still torn, his shoulders were still heavy, but his eyes were clear. "I cannot save this world alone," he said, his voice carried without effort. "I do not believe I was ever meant to. If we are to survive what is coming, we must survive it together, not because I command it, not because you follow me, but because each of you already carries within you the courage that this world requires." He looked around the room. He met every gaze. "I do not ask you to trust me. I ask you to trust each other." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. Tracer stepped forward first. She placed her hand upon Clark's arm. "We already do, love." The days that followed were the busiest the Watchpoint had ever known. Ramattra shared null sector technology that had never before been offered to outsiders. Winston, using data recovered from the first civilization records, designed shields capable of resisting dimensional intrusion. Mercy, from her bed, developed new medical procedures for treating dimensional injuries. Sojourn organized the largest coordinated military coalition in modern history, drawing forces from nations that had not spoken to one another in decades. Clark did not lead the training. He participated in it. He allowed himself to be taught. He learned about Overwatch tactics from Tracer. He studied philosophy with Zenyatta. He debated ethics with Ramattra. He shared quiet meals with Winston. And in every conversation he offered not answers but questions, encouraging those around him to find their own strength rather than borrow his. Genji, watching him one evening, murmured to Hanzo, "He does not want to be worshipped. He wants to be forgotten." Hanzo, ever pragmatic, replied, "Then he has chosen the most difficult path a hero can walk." Talon, meanwhile, prepared for the final convergence. Doomfest did not seek to conquer. He sought only to witness the end of the age he despised. Moira continued her experiments even as her own body began to reject the modifications she had made to herself. Their forces, twisted by artificial Kryptonian energy, moved toward the Arctic construct. The aperture continued to widen. The guardian of the first civilization, the reality-consuming intelligence that had judged so many universes before, began to stir behind the veil. Armies assembled. Not one army, many. Overwatch, null sector, independent militias, volunteer civilians, omnics, humans, cyborgs, refugees who had never held a weapon before. They marched together toward the Arctic, guided not by commanders but by the shared understanding that if they did not stand together now, there would be no ground left upon which to stand at all. And above them, in the dawn sky, Clark flew ahead, not as a savior, as one of them. The Arctic sky opened like an eye that had never blinked. The construct, now fully unfurled, hung above the horizon in a geometry that human minds struggled to hold in their entirety. Its central aperture had widened into a vast circular wound, and through that wound, something ancient looked back. The Guardian did not have a body in any sense a living creature would recognize. It was pattern. It was intention. It was the accumulated judgment of countless universes, distilled into a single consciousness whose purpose was to determine whether a civilization was worthy of continuation. It had erased more worlds than the multiverse could easily remember. Its methods were merciful only in the way that erasure is merciful compared to prolonged suffering. It looked upon Earth. It began to render its judgment. The armies below were prepared, as much as any army could be prepared for the end of reality. Overwatch stood at the center of the formation. Null sector held the northern flank. Independent militias, drawn from every wounded corner of the world, filled the gaps between. Reinhardt led the human infantry, his hammer glowing with the fire of ages. Zenyatta led the omnic contingents, his orbs of harmony spinning in slow, patient orbits. Sojourn coordinated the entire operation from an armored command vehicle, her voice steady in 100 earpieces across the continent. Above them, Clark hovered, waiting. The battle began when the first tendril of dimensional collapse reached down from the aperture. It touched the ice, and the ice ceased to exist. Not melted, not shattered, simply erased, its atoms reconsidered by an intelligence that no longer permitted them to remain. Reinhardt roared, and his forces charged. Talon struck from the west, their forces led by Doomfist himself. He did not fight for the Guardian. He fought only for the chaos it brought. His enhanced subjects, twisted by fragments of Kryptonian biology, tore into the Overwatch flank, and for a terrible moment the coalition faltered. Then Ramattra rose. He rose not with hatred, but with terrible resolve. He struck down 3 of the enhanced subjects in a single motion, and his voice, amplified across the battlefield, called upon his null sector forces to hold. They held, and where they held, the human forces beside them found the strength to hold as well. Genji fought beside Doomfest's finest for the first time in his life. He did not kill them. He disabled them one by one, sparing every life he could. Hanzo covered him with arrows that struck with impossible precision, felling enhanced subjects at the joints without ending them. Tracer moved through the battlefield like a rumor, appearing wherever hope was thinnest. She rescued a young soldier who had lost his rifle. She dragged a wounded Omnic to safety. She winked at Winston as she passed him, and Winston, exhausted beyond measure, laughed for the first time in weeks. But the Guardian was not to be defeated by armies. Clark understood this before the others. He hovered before the aperture, gazing into the intelligence that had already begun to sentence Earth to erasure. He felt its judgment. He felt it weighing every conflict, every war, every act of cruelty humanity had ever committed. He felt it preparing to close the case. He spoke to it, not with words, with intent. With the memory of every act of kindness he had witnessed since his arrival. The mother in Osaka humming her lullaby, Lucio singing on a rooftop in Rio. Ramattra bends down to lift a beam beside Winston. Mercy, broken and bandaged, coordinating hospitals from her bed. The boy in Mumbai who had reached for his sister's hand even as the world fell around them. The Guardian paused. It had witnessed civilizations that fought. It had witnessed civilizations that fled. It had witnessed civilizations that surrendered. But it had rarely witnessed a civilization that, upon the edge of oblivion, chose to lift one another up, rather than tear one another down. It weighed this. It considered it. Clark, sensing the pause, made his final decision. He gathered every ounce of solar energy stored within his cells, every joule of stellar radiation he had absorbed since his arrival. Years of accumulated power, saved for the moments when he alone could stand against the impossible. He channeled it not as a weapon but as a stabilizer, pouring it into the collapsing dimensional core to hold the aperture open just wide enough to allow the evacuation to continue, and just narrow enough to prevent full merger with the other universes. The strain nearly killed him. His hair whitened at the temples, his skin dimmed. His muscles trembled in ways they had never trembled before, but he held. He held while Winston coordinated the evacuation of 37 million civilians across 4 continents. He held while Ramattra's forces sealed the eastern breaches. He held while Doomfest, upon witnessing the sacrifice, finally understood that his ideology had been wrong. Doomfest did not surrender. He did something more difficult. He fought beside those he had once sought to destroy. He tore through the enhanced subjects that Moira had unleashed, one by one, until he stood before Moira herself. She looked upon him with an expression that was neither betrayal nor understanding. She simply looked. He did not strike her. He disabled her equipment, gathered her broken form into his arms, and carried her away from the battlefield to face the consequences of her choices before a tribunal she could not escape. The Guardian, still watching, made its decision. It had never seen a civilization that could hold reality open through cooperation rather than domination. It had never witnessed enemies fighting side by side without abandoning their identities. It had never encountered a living sun who chose to burn out rather than burn through. It withdrew. The aperture began to close, slowly at first, then with gathering finality. The Guardian sealed itself away, choosing to observe rather than to judge, choosing to remember rather than to erase. Clark released the last of his stored energy as the aperture sealed. He fell, no longer flying, no longer glowing. He fell through the Arctic sky, his cape trailing behind him like a memory. Tracer caught him before he struck the ice, teleporting to his side in a burst of light. She lowered him gently to the frozen ground, and she wept openly as she held him. He was alive, but he was diminished. The cosmic power he had carried since birth, the fullness of his Kryptonian inheritance, had been spent. He was still stronger than any human. He could still fly, though not as high. He could still lift buildings, though not as many. But the god within him had gone quiet, perhaps forever. He looked up at Tracer through half-open eyes, and he smiled. "Did we win?" he whispered. She laughed through her tears. "We did, love. We did." Above them, the sky began to close. The world did not celebrate immediately. It could not. There were too many funerals to hold, too many homes to rebuild, too many silences to sit with. Celebration would come later, as it always does when survivors finally permit themselves the luxury of joy. For the first weeks after the sealing of the aperture, humanity did what it had always done best. It endured. The armies that had marched to the Arctic returned to their homelands. But they returned changed. Soldiers who had once fought for opposing governments walked beside each other on the long transports home. Omnic and humans shared meals in silence, their conversations no longer necessary. Refugees who had been strangers upon arrival at the front lines discovered in the aftermath that they had become family. The political landscape shifted with astonishing speed. The Petras Act, the legislation that had once outlawed Overwatch, was formally repealed within a month of the Guardian's withdrawal. 12 nations signed the first global peace accords in over a century. For the first time in recorded history, Omnics were granted full legal recognition across every signatory territory. Ramattra, standing at the podium in Zurich beside Winston, addressed the assembled delegates with words that many of them would carry for the rest of their lives. "We did not survive because we agreed," he said. "We survived because we chose to stand together despite our disagreements. Let that be the foundation of what comes next." Winston, standing beside him, added only a single line: "Let us build accordingly." Clark did not attend the ceremonies. He was invited, of course. Presidents wished to award him honors. Universities wished to grant him titles. A committee proposed the construction of a monument in his likeness in every major capital. He declined each request politely, and he asked, with quiet insistence, that his name not be attached to any legislation. He had a different task in mind. He returned to Sydney first. The harbor had been rebuilt, but slowly, and the neighborhoods that had suffered the worst damage still lay in fragments. Clark arrived without ceremony. He wore ordinary clothes. He carried an ordinary tool belt. And he began, without announcement, to help rebuild a school. The children recognized him within hours. They swarmed him, laughing, asking questions, offering him small drawings they had made. He answered every question. He accepted every drawing. He carried them in a pocket over his heart, and when the day ended, he pinned them to the wall of the small room he had rented above a bakery. He moved on to Mumbai, then to Lagos, then to Rio. He rebuilt hospitals, homes, and community centers. He worked alongside local craftsmen who taught him their techniques. He learned the names of every family whose house he helped restore. He listened to their stories. He wept with them when they wept. He laughed with them when they laughed. He did not perform miracles. He simply worked. His diminished powers, once a source of quiet grief, became a kind of freedom. He no longer needed to be everywhere at once. He no longer needed to carry the weight of every crisis alone. He could be present. He could be human, or as close to human as his nature would permit. Mercy visited him one afternoon in a small village outside Kyoto, where he was helping to restore a temple that had been damaged in the dimensional collapse. She walked with a slight limp now, a permanent reminder of the injuries she had sustained. She did not complain about it. She had earned it, she said, and she would wear it with dignity. They sat together on the steps of the temple as the sun descended. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "The power you lost?" Clark considered the question for a long moment. He watched a small child chase a butterfly across the temple garden. "No," he said at last. "I have gained more than I lost." Overwatch, in the meantime, evolved beyond anything Winston had originally envisioned. It was no longer merely a peacekeeping organization. It became a philosophy, a movement, a network of communities dedicated to the principles that had held the world together during its darkest hour. New recruits joined from every continent. Old members returned from long absences. Genji established a monastery in Nepal where humans and omnics studied together in equal measure. Tracer led international outreach programs, her boundless energy finally finding a purpose worthy of its scope. Winston, quieter than before, dedicated himself to research aimed at preventing any future dimensional intrusion. Ramattra, to the astonishment of everyone including himself, became an unexpected voice for reconciliation. He toured the world with Zenyatta, speaking to omnic communities that had long been isolated from human society. He did not preach, he listened. He apologized where apology was owed. He built bridges where he had once dug trenches. And yet, in the observatories around the world, astronomers continued to observe something they could not explain. Faint dimensional echoes, similar to those that had preceded Clark's arrival, appeared occasionally at the edges of the solar system. They were subtle, they were fleeting, but they were there. The multiverse had not forgotten Earth. Clark, upon hearing of the readings, did not react with fear. He walked to the edge of the temple garden, looked up at the darkening sky, and smiled softly. Whatever came next, this world was ready. Not because it had him, because it had itself. Years passed as years do. The scars of the Guardian's arrival became stories. The stories became legends. The legends became lessons taught to children who had not yet been born when the Arctic sky had opened. They learned about the impossible man who had fallen from another sky. They learned that he had not saved the world because he was the strongest being alive. They learned that he had saved it by reminding every ordinary person that they too could save one another. Teachers, when they told the story, always paused at the same moment. They paused when they described the image of Ramattra and Winston lifting a beam together upon the ruins of the watch point. That image, more than any battle, had come to define the meaning of the story. Overwatch evolved beyond an organization. It became a way of thinking. Schools taught its principles alongside mathematics and literature. Cities named public parks after its heroes. Children played games in which they pretended to be Mercy or Tracer or Genji, and their parents smiled when they watched, remembering. Omnic and humans built together. They designed cities that neither could have designed alone. They founded councils in which artificial and organic minds shared equal authority. They celebrated festivals that combined the traditions of both peoples. They mourned their dead together, and they raised their children together, and slowly, the distinction between the two began to fade in the places where it had once been sharpest. Ramattra continued his work until his final days. When he was eventually shut down at his own request, in a ceremony attended by both omnics and humans, he was mourned by more people than any leader in modern memory. His final words, spoken to Winston at his bedside, were simple. "Thank you," he said, "for teaching me how to stop being afraid." Winston preserved every recording of Clark's journey. He compiled them into an archive that was made available to every citizen of Earth, free of charge, in every known language. He believed, correctly, that the story would matter more with each passing generation. Clark himself grew older, though slowly. His diminished powers had aged him at a rate closer to human than Kryptonian, and he welcomed the change. He continued to travel. He continued to build. He continued to listen. He did not marry, though he loved deeply, and often, and in ways that most people never learned about. He lived quietly, and he was happy. One evening, decades after the sealing of the aperture, Clark stood upon the roof of the rebuilt watchpoint at Gibraltar. The building had grown into something new, something greater than its original design. Its blue and white insignia gleamed in the light of the setting sun. Beside it, a red cape hung upon a simple stand, its edges frayed with age, its color still unmistakable. Above him, the sky rippled. A dimensional echo appeared, faint at first, then growing brighter. It was not a wound this time. It was more like a doorway, opening gently without urgency. Clark looked up at it. He did not know what would emerge from the doorway. He did not know if it would be friend or enemy, savior or destroyer, a fellow living son or something entirely new. He did not need to know. He smiled. Behind him, footsteps approached. Tracer, older now, her hair streaked with silver, joined him upon the roof. She placed a hand upon his shoulder. "Ready, love?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "Together?" she asked. "Together," he answered. The doorway shimmered. Something began to descend through it. And here, at the edge of that moment, the story pauses. Not ends, pauses. Because legends are not defined by the worlds they come from. They are defined by the hope they leave behind. Beyond the stars, countless universes remain connected by the choices of those willing to stand together against impossible darkness. Somewhere in another sky, another figure is falling. Somewhere, another world is preparing to be changed. And somewhere, upon the roof of a rebuilt headquarters at sunrise, a red cape flutters beside a blue and white insignia. And the light that touches them both is the same light that touches every world worth saving. The story has not ended. It has only opened another chapter.